Now we're going to talk about the CSS box model. So this is a pretty simple concept, but it can be a little tricky to understand, and it's an important way to structure a website. So I'll go over it now. So every HTML element can basically thought of as a box. So whether it's a paragraph or a header or a body, whatever it is, you can basically think of it as a box. Each box has a margin, which is the space around the box. It has a border, which in these boxes here, this is that orange solid thick line. Then you can specify the thickness of that border. Then there's padding, and that's the space in between the border and your actual content. And then there's the content, and the content for these purposes is just the size of the actual content, which is the dotted line in the middle of these boxes. The margin plus the border thickness plus the padding plus the size of the content gives you the total width and height of your HTML element and how it'll appear on your web page. And that's that dotted orange line around the outside of both of these. And then I'll just show you, we go to an actual website and we do this right click and inspect here. That'll take us to actually be able to see a web page and the actual elements. So if we click on any of these elements, you can basically see here what the margin, border, padding, and the size of the actual content is for each one of these. So we go in here and then scroll down. So our H1 header, this is my homepage up here section, has these following dimensions. And we define these in our CSS file as well as just how the page is displayed. And if we click down here, we can do the same thing for any element. So these are H links. This is our main. As you can see, it's going to be slightly different for each one, depending on whether or not we defined margins and borders and whether or not an element appears within another element or not. So that's the basic concept. I'll stick a little bit more once you actually start playing around with it. So that's what some of these projects are designed to do, just give you some experience playing around with it. And I would definitely recommend you to try it out for yourself and tinker with it to see how it actually works. So again, this is just a little bit more on the CSS box model. You can change different attributes of the box model. So the margin, again, is the space on the outside. The syntax for this allows you to change the margin on the top, right, bottom, or left, all in one line of code. Or you can change just the tops and bottoms in the same segment, and the left and the right in the same segment. Or you can use what's called the auto, and this will basically automatically put a margin on the left or the right. Just usually will center your element. And then you can also specify just one with a margin / top. You can specify just margin on the top. The border is mainly talking around the thickness of the border. You can also make it solid. You can change the color, you can make it dash. There's a few different ways to play with this. And there's also this border radius. That way, instead of having a square box, you can make rounded corners. And then again, padding is the space in between the content of your HTML element and the actual border of the HTML element. This next concept is the difference between block items and inline items. Basically, block means we'll have an HTML element and then another HTML element right next to it and another one right next to it. If it's inline, that means it's on top of each other. And then the other one is display none, which means it's invisible. So each of these can be useful in different ways. Block versus inline is mainly useful just for arranging things on a page. And the display none is helpful when you're using JavaScript to hide or show different types of objects. Then there's also the text-align center. So this works on block level elements only, not inline, but just helps align things in different ways. So you can either center it, you can align it to the left or the right. So there's a few different things you can do here. And again, inline just means that everything is stacked on top or stacked next to each other. So block is stacked on top, inline is stacked next to each other. All right, then we have positioning and sizing. So these are just different ways to position your box. The box sizing, this is talking about how exactly the margins and borders and padding are combined with the size of the content. The next is absolute versus relative versus fixed. So absolute allows you to start off at a specific point and then make it a little bit different from wherever that starting point is. So you can say it starts here, and then really the start of the box is here. So this allows you to anchor your boxes, your elements to a specific point in the beginning or at the top left of the page. Fixed allows you to keep everything constant. It's similar to absolute, but when you scroll down on the page, it doesn't move with you. Whereas absolute, it will just stay there. And then relative positioning will allow you to have a box or an element be positioned inside or next to another element, and it'll be relative to that those other elements. Then there's this another concept called flex boxes. This will allow you to have the size of your boxes change dynamically as the browser gets bigger or smaller. This is particularly helpful for mobile web development. That way your pages always fit on whatever screen size that your viewer is looking at it on without having to completely change all of your code. It's also useful because sometimes on a desktop, the user will change the size of the window. So this will allow each of the elements within to automatically adjust accordingly. So in order to do this, you basically have the main, the parent HTML element. So in this case, it'll be main. I'll set that to display flex, and then you'll have two divs within inside that main, and you'll change the width as a percentage. That way, as the main element gets bigger or smaller, div 1 and div 2 will always fill up 100% of the main, but they'll move in accordance with the size of main. So that way, div 1 will always be 60% of the main box, and div 2 will always be 40% of the main box, and they'll move as the web page changes. You can also align the elements in terms of top and bottom and left to right. And there's a few other different options in terms of how you can actually start aligning your content here.